1624, the tip of Manhattan Island. Long before the glass monoliths of lower Manhattan pierced the clouds, and long before the frantic shouting of floor traders defined the rhythm of the city, this land was a dense, untamed wilderness of ancient forests and marshlands. To the indigenous Lenape people, it was a sacred landscape of hunting grounds and waterways. But to the Dutch West India Company, it was something else entirely. It was a strategic outpost for a global commercial empire. When the Dutch settlers arrived to establish New Amsterdam, they weren't looking to build a democracy or a cultural capital. They were looking for a foothold in the lucrative fur trade. This was the seed of an idea that would eventually reshape the world. The concept of a society built primarily around the movement of goods, the management of risk, and the pursuit of profit. New Amsterdam was a chaotic, multicultural experiment. It was a port town, messy and vibrant, squeezed between the Hudson River and the East River. But this prosperity came with a profound vulnerability. As a small, isolated settlement on the edge of a vast and often hostile frontier, the colonists lived in constant fear of raids from local tribes or incursions from rival colonial powers like the English. The solution to this anxiety was not a treaty, but a barrier. In the mid-1650s, under the administration of Director General Peter Stuyvesant, a man known for his iron will and uncompromising pragmatism, the settlement took a physical step toward fortification. To protect the heart of the commerce, the Dutch constructed a defensive structure, a wooden stockade, reinforced with earth and stone. This wasn't a grand monument. It was a rugged, utilitarian wall that ran east to west, cutting across the southern tip of the island. It served as a boundary, a shield, and a checkpoint. It delineated the civilized world of the Dutch trading post from the perceived chaos of the wilderness beyond. But as the decades passed, the threat of physical invasion receded. The English eventually seized the territory, renaming it New York, and the wooden palisade began to rot and decay. The physical wall was eventually torn down, its timber repurposed, its dirt leveled. The barrier that once protected merchants from arrows and muskets was gone. Yet, as the city expanded northward, the ghost of that barrier remained. The path cleared by the old stockade became a permanent fixture in the city's geography. It became a street, a narrow, bustling corridor that would eventually take on a symbolic weight far greater than its original purpose. That street was named Wall Street. The physical fortifications of the Dutch were gone, but the concept of the wall had been etched into the DNA of the settlement. It had established a sense of place, a specific, demarcated zone where commerce was conducted, where boundaries were set, and where the rules of trade began to take precedence over the laws of the wilderness. The transition from a colonial outpost to a financial epicenter had begun, not with a stock ticker, but with a pile of timber meant to keep the world at bay. 1670, the bustling docks of New York Harbor. The wooden palisade had long since rotted into the soil, but the spirit of the wall remained. While the physical barrier had vanished, the economic barrier was becoming more sophisticated. New York was no longer just a fortified outpost. It was becoming a node in a vast, pulsing web of global exchange. This was the era of mercantilism, a period of history defined by a singular, ruthless conviction that a nation's power was measured by the amount of gold and silver in its coffers, and that the world's wealth was a finite pie, to be seized and guarded. Under this doctrine, trade was not merely a way to acquire goods, It was a form of economic warfare. The colonial project was the engine of this machine. The vast territories of the Americas, Africa, and the East Indies were viewed as resource reservoirs, feeding a hungry metropole. In the harbors of the New World, the cargo was diverse, exotic, and immensely valuable. Beaver pelts from the northern forests, tobacco from the southern plantations, sugar from the Caribbean, and spices from the distant Orient. These were not just commodities, they were the building blocks of capital. To understand the birth of Wall Street, one must understand the sheer scale of the risk involved in this era. To participate in mercantilist trade was to gamble with fate. A merchant might invest his entire fortune into a single vessel, a wooden shell laden with precious cargo, and send it across an Atlantic dominated by unpredictable storms and privateers. One rogue wave or one intercepted ship could mean total ruin. This inherent volatility necessitated a new way of thinking about money. It was no longer enough to simply possess wealth. One had to manage the risk of losing it. As the volume of trade grew, so too did the complexity of the transactions. The merchant class began to move away from simple bartering and toward a more sophisticated system of credit, bills of exchange, and maritime insurance. Wealth was being abstracted. It was moving from the tangible, the weight of a gold coin or the scent of a spice crate, to the intangible, the promise of future payment and the calculation of probability. The profits extracted from the colonial periphery were being funneled into the growing urban centers, creating a concentrated pool of liquid capital. This was the alchemy of the era. By extracting raw materials from the colonies and selling them back as finished goods, or by facilitating the flow of goods between distant empires, a new class of middlemen emerged. These were the men who sat in the coffee houses and counting houses of New York, calculating margins and speculating on the arrival of the next fleet. They were learning that money could be made not just by owning things, but by facilitating the movement of things. The groundwork was being laid. The colonial trade routes were the arteries, the commodities were the lifeblood, and the growing accumulation of surplus wealth was the fuel. The stage was being set for a transformation, the shift from a world of merchants trading goods to a world of financiers trading the idea of value. The era of mercantilism had turned the Atlantic into a conveyor belt of capital, and New York was positioned to be its most vital gatekeeper. May 17, 1792. A street in Lower Manhattan, shaded by the spreading canopy of a buttonwood tree. The era of mercantilism had successfully funneled vast amounts of wealth into New York, but that wealth was currently trapped in a state of chaotic, uncoordinated friction. The merchants, the speculators, and the brokers who sat in the coffee houses were operating in a digital age world without the benefit of a digital age infrastructure. Trading was a fragmented, exhausting, and often predatory affair. If you wanted to buy shares in a shipping venture or a government bond, you had to hunt down a broker through word of mouth, often risking being cheated by inconsistent pricing or dubious middlemen. There was no central floor, no standardized rules, and no shared sense of trust. The market was a cacophony of individual voices, each shouting a different price for the same asset. It was a wild west of finance, where the lack of order was as much a barrier to growth as any physical wall. But on this spring morning in 1792, 24 men decided that the chaos had to end. They gathered under the shade of a buttonwood tree, not as titans of industry, but as a small group of practitioners seeking stability. These men, Brokers who dealt in stocks, government securities, and commodities recognized a fundamental truth. For capital to truly flow, there had to be a system. They drafted a simple, short document that would become known as the Buttonwood Agreement. It was not a complex manifesto of economic theory. It was a pact of mutual necessity. The agreement stipulated that these brokers would only trade with one another, and they would do so on a fixed commission rate. In the language of modern finance, they were creating a closed-loop ecosystem. By limiting their pool of counterparties, they were effectively inventing liquidity. By standardizing their commissions, they were inventing transparency. By agreeing to a set of shared rules, they were inventing trust. The Buttonwood Agreement was the moment the idea of value finally found a home. It transformed a collection of disconnected speculators into a unified institution. They were no longer just men trading bits of paper in the shadows of counting houses. They were the architects of a centralized marketplace. This meeting did not just create a club, it birthed the New York Stock Exchange. What began as a handshake under a tree provided the essential architecture for the American experiment. The young United States, still reeling from the debt of the Revolutionary War, desperately needed a way to fund its burgeoning existence. The Buttonwood Agreement provided the mechanism. It allowed the government to sell its debt and allowed private enterprises to tap into the pool of capital that the merchants had so painstakingly accumulated. The transition was complete. The physical wall of the Dutch settlers had been replaced by a structural wall of regulation and agreement. The gatekeeper of the Atlantic was no longer just watching ships come into the harbor. He was now presiding over the exchange of the very concept of ownership. The seeds of the world's most powerful financial engine had been planted in the soil of Manhattan. And as the decades to follow would prove, those seeds would grow into a force capable of both building empires and toppling nations. Late 18th century, the bustling, saltire docks of Lower Manhattan. While the Buttonwood Agreement provided the rules of the game, the players themselves were already deeply entrenched in a much older, much more visceral form of wealth. To understand why these men were so desperate for a centralized exchange, you have to understand where their money actually came from. It didn't come from spreadsheets or algorithms. It came from the hold of a ship, the sweat of sailors, and the unpredictable rhythms of the Atlantic Ocean. Before Wall Street was a center of finance, it was a center of logistics. The true architects of New York's early prosperity were the merchant class, a tight-knit, powerful elite whose fortunes were tied to the movement of physical goods across vast, dangerous distances. This was the era of the commodity. Wealth was not an abstract number on a screen. It was tangible. It was a barrel of West Indian sugar, a bale of indigo, a crate of spices, or a shipment of timber from the northern colonies. These merchants were the bridge between the raw resources of the New World and the insatiable markets of Europe. They operated in a world of high stakes and even higher risks. A single storm in the mid-Atlantic, a seasonal shift in trade winds, or a sudden skirmish between colonial powers could mean the difference between a lifetime of luxury and total bankruptcy. When a merchant invested his capital into a voyage, he wasn't just buying goods. He was betting on human endurance and the mercy of the sea. Because the risks were so immense, the merchants had to innovate. They couldn't fund a massive expedition into the East Indies or a transatlantic voyage with a single purse. They needed to spread the risk. This necessity gave rise to the earliest forms of fractional ownership and joint stock ventures. They began to pool their resources, dividing the costs and the potential profits of a voyage among multiple investors. In doing so, they were inadvertently practicing the very essence of the stock market, the commodification of risk. As these shipping empires grew, so did the complexity of their needs. It wasn't enough to simply own the ships. One had to manage the insurance, the warehouses, the credit lines, and the fluctuating prices of the goods themselves. The merchant class became the de facto bankers of the colonial era. They extended credit to farmers in the hinterlands, financed the construction of vessels, and managed the complex exchange of goods for hard currency. This concentration of liquid wealth created a new kind of social hierarchy in New York. These were the families who sat in the front pews of the churches and the most prestigious tables of the coffee houses. They were the men who possessed the specie, the actual gold and silver, that the young American government so desperately required to function. The merchant class had turned New York into a gravitational well for capital. They had mastered the art of moving physical things, and in doing so, they had created a massive, concentrated pool of wealth that was simply waiting for a way to move faster. They had built the engine of commerce. The Buttonwood Agreement was simply the mechanism that would allow that engine to shift from the slow, heavy grind of maritime trade into the high-velocity world of modern finance. May 1837, Lower Manhattan. For decades, the engine of American prosperity had been accelerating. The merchant class had successfully transitioned from moving barrels of sugar to moving paper. The wealth that once arrived on the slow, creaking hulls of sailing ships was now being multiplied through a much faster, much more dangerous medium: credit. By the mid-1830s, the United States was gripped by a fever. It was a period of frantic westward expansion and a land boom that felt, to many, like an endless upward climb. But this growth wasn't being fueled by the steady accumulation of gold or silver. Instead, it was being driven by paper, banknotes issued by a sprawling, unregulated web of state banks. These banks were issuing loans with reckless abandon, often backed by nothing more than the perceived value of land that had yet to be surveyed, let alone settled. This was the era of the Wildcat Bank. Far from the watchful eyes of any central authority, these institutions operated on the fringes of legitimacy, printing their own currency and lending it out to speculators who were betting everything on the rising price of real estate. The economy had become a house of cards, built on a foundation of speculative debt and a desperate, collective belief that prices would never stop rising. The cracks began to show in early 1837. The catalyst was a sudden contraction in credit, triggered by a combination of falling cotton prices in Europe and a tightening of land sales by the federal government. Suddenly, the paper that had once felt as good as gold began to lose its luster. The specie, the actual gold and silver that underpinned the entire system, began to vanish. As the realization set in that the banks didn't actually have the hard currency to back their notes, panic ignited. It spread through the coffee houses and the counting rooms of Wall Street like a wildfire. Depositors rushed to their local banks to demand their money, only to find the vaults empty. The state banks, once seen as engines of progress, were suddenly revealed to be nothing more than engines of illusion. The collapse was total. Credit evaporated overnight. The massive land bubbles burst, leaving speculators holding worthless deeds to untamed wilderness. Businesses that had expanded based on the assumption of easy money folded within weeks. For the merchant families who had helped build this financial ecosystem, the fall was devastating. The very liquidity they had worked so hard to consolidate was sucked out of the market, leaving a vacuum of frozen assets and broken promises. The Panic of 1837 was more than just a bad year for the markets. It was a traumatic awakening. It was the first time the young American economy felt the true, crushing weight of systemic volatility. It proved that when wealth is untethered from reality, when it moves too far away from the tangible goods of the docks and into the abstract realm of unchecked credit, the descent is as violent as the ascent was intoxicating. As the dust settled, a grim lesson remained etched into the psyche of the American financier. Prosperity is often a mask for instability, and the distance between a golden age and a total collapse is often nothing more than the speed at which the truth catches up to the speculation. April 1861, Washington, D.C. The hard-won lessons of the Panic of 1837 had barely been integrated into the national consciousness before a much more violent tremor threatened to shatter the American experiment entirely. The outbreak of the Civil War did more than divide a nation geographically. It forced a fundamental, radical evolution in the way a nation finances its existence. Before the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, the American financial system was still largely localized, built on a patchwork of state banks and a merchant class that traded in commodities and land. But war on this scale, a total war, requires something far more massive than mere commerce. It requires an unprecedented mobilization of capital. The Union needed to feed, clothe, and arm millions of men. It needed to forge hundreds of thousands of rifles, cast massive cannons, and construct a logistical web that could span a continent. The sheer scale of the cost was staggering. The federal government found itself facing a massive deficit, and the traditional methods of collecting taxes and managing revenue were woefully inadequate for the sudden, voracious appetite of a wartime economy. The Union was essentially bankrupt by design, and it had to find a way to invent money where none existed. This desperation became the ultimate catalyst for the sophistication of Wall Street. To fund the war, the government could no longer rely on the slow trickle of customs duties. Instead, it turned to the markets. This era saw the birth of large-scale, systematic bond issuances. The government began selling war bonds to the public, a move that effectively transformed the American citizen into a stakeholder in the survival of the state. But for the institutional players on Wall Street, the war presented an even more complex opportunity: the massive expansion of the national debt. To facilitate these massive transfers of capital, the financial architecture had to become more robust, more interconnected, and far more complex. We see the rise of the major investment banks, acting as intermediaries between the desperate needs of the Treasury and the surplus capital of a growing industrial class. They weren't just moving money anymore. They were engineering the very instruments of national survival. As the war raged, the nature of speculation changed. It was no longer just about the price of cotton or the value of a New York townhouse. It became a high-stakes gamble on the very outcome of the conflict. Investors began betting on the success of railroad contracts, the procurement of iron, and the industrial output of northern factories. The volatility was no longer a localized fever. It was a national heartbeat, tied directly to the movements of armies on distant battlefields. The Civil War effectively ended the era of simple finance. It forced the United States to move away from a decentralized system of local credit and toward a centralized, sophisticated, and highly leveraged financial machine. The war proved that in a modern state, The ability to wage war is inextricably linked to the ability to manipulate and mobilize complex debt. By the time the smoke cleared in 1865, Wall Street had been forged in fire. It had emerged not just as a hub for merchants, but as the indispensable engine of the federal government, a powerful, complex, and deeply integrated complex of capital that would go on to fund the industrial explosion of the Gilded Age. The transition from the merchant's ledger to the financier's bond was complete. 1865, New York City. The guns had fallen silent, but the roar of the machine was only just beginning. If the Civil War had forged Wall Street in fire, the subsequent decades would see it drenched in oil, steel, and coal. The nation was no longer a collection of fractured states struggling for survival. It was a singular, hungry entity poised to become the greatest industrial engine the world had ever seen. But an engine of this magnitude required more than just ambition. It required a level of capital so vast it was previously unimaginable. This was the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, a period where the very fabric of American life was being rewoven by steam and iron. This was the era when the scale of human enterprise shifted from the local to the continental. To build the transcontinental railroads that would stitch the coasts together, to forge the steel beams that would pierce the skyline of Manhattan, and to construct the massive networks of telegraph lines that would allow information to travel faster than a galloping horse. The nation needed more than just gold. It needed a sophisticated mechanism to harness the collective wealth of a growing middle class and funnel it into the hands of those building the future. Wall Street became that mechanism. The transition was profound. We moved from an era of merchant trading, where wealth was found in a crate of spices or a bale of cotton, to an era of corporate capitalism. The company became the new unit of power. For the first time, the massive costs of industrialization were too great for any single individual to bear. The solution was the modern corporation, a vehicle designed to aggregate enormous amounts of capital from thousands of different investors, spreading both the risk and the reward. This period saw the birth of the massive industrial sectors that would define the American century. The railroad industry, in particular, acted as the ultimate laboratory for modern finance. A single railroad line could cost tens of millions of dollars, a sum that could bankrupt a small nation. To fund these iron arteries, Wall Street perfected the art of the bond issue and the massive equity offering. The stock market ceased to be a playground for speculators and became the vital circulatory system of the industrial body. But this rapid expansion came with a dark, unregulated intensity. As the infrastructure of a superpower rose from the ground, so too did a new breed of financial predator. The complexity of these new industrial giants created information asymmetry, a gap between what the masters of industry knew and what the public understood. This gap was where the real power resided. Capital was being concentrated into fewer and fewer hands, creating a feedback loop where wealth didn't just accumulate, it consolidated. The infrastructure being built wasn't just physical, it was financial. The railroads, the steel mills, and the oil refineries were the hardware, but the complex web of stocks, bonds, and credit emerging from the canyons of Lower Manhattan was the software. Wall Street was no longer just a marketplace. It was becoming the central nervous system of the American economy, directing the flow of resources toward the most powerful players. As the smoke of the factories began to darken the horizon, a new reality was setting in. America was becoming a superpower, But that power was being built on a foundation of immense, interconnected, and increasingly volatile capital. The stage was set for the titans of this new world to step into the light. 1870, New York City. If the Industrial Revolution provided the hardware of a new America, then the men who emerged from its smoke were the architects of its soul. We enter the era of the Titans, a period where the line between business leader and sovereign ruler became dangerously thin. These were not mere merchants. They were the architects of monopoly, men who understood that in a world of infinite competition, the only way to win was to eliminate the very concept of a competitor. At the center of this storm stood the Vanderbilt dynasty. Cornelius Vanderbilt had already mastered the art of the railroad, transforming a chaotic collection of disconnected tracks into a unified, unstoppable network of commerce. But the Vanderbilts' legacy was more than just iron and steam. They pioneered the use of aggressive consolidation. By controlling the arteries of American transport, they controlled the pace of the nation's heartbeat. To move goods, to move people, and to move capital, one had to pass through the Vanderbilt gates. They proved that whoever controlled the infrastructure of movement controlled the wealth of the nation. But while the Vanderbilts commanded the rails, a different kind of power was being refined in the shadows of the oil refineries, the power of Standard Oil. John D. Rockefeller did not just build a company, he engineered a system of total dominance. Rockefeller understood a fundamental truth of the new economy. It was not enough to be the best, you had to be the only. Through a relentless strategy of horizontal integration and secret rebates with railroads, he squeezed competitors out of existence, creating a web of trusts that reached into every corner of American life. Rockefeller's wealth became so vast, so concentrated, that it defied the traditional understanding of money. He turned the volatility of the energy market into a predictable, monolithic machine, proving that in the age of the tycoons, scale was the ultimate weapon. Yet if Rockefeller was the master of industry, J. Pierpont Morgan was the master of the money itself. If the tycoons built the machines, Morgan was the man who decided which machines were allowed to run. As the leader of the House of Morgan, he moved beyond the mere trading of stocks to the orchestration of entire industries. He was the ultimate financier, a man who operated with a level of discretion and authority that made the government look amateurish. When the markets trembled, it was Morgan who stepped in, not out of altruism, but to stabilize the systems that served his interests. He practiced Morganization, a process of taking over fractured, chaotic industries and reorganizing them into efficient, profitable, and controlled monopolies. He was the high priest of the money trust, a figure who sat at the apex of a pyramid of capital, deciding which railroads would thrive and which steel mills would collapse. Together, these men created a new American reality. The economy was no longer a collection of small, competing interests. It was a controlled ecosystem of massive, interlocking giants. This was the era of the robber baron, a term born of the public's growing realization that the prosperity of the nation was being harvested by a tiny, untouchable elite. The wealth being generated was staggering, but it was also terrifying. The sheer concentration of power in the hands of Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and Morgan created a vacuum of oversight, a period where the giants could grow without limit, unchecked by law or morality. The stage was set for a clash between the unstoppable force of concentrated capital and the mounting pressure of a nation that was beginning to wonder, who truly owns America? 1873, New York City. If the tycoons were the masters of the new order, the railroad was the engine that powered their ascent. To the average American, the railroad was a miracle of modernity, a steel ribbon stitching a fragmented continent into a single, cohesive nation. But to the speculators on Wall Street, the railroad was something far more intoxicating. It was the ultimate financial instrument. It was a vehicle for wealth that possessed a quality no other industry had ever offered: the promise of infinite, exponential growth. The mechanics of this boom were as complex as they were seductive. Unlike a factory, which required years to build and steady demand to profit, a railroad could be conjured out of thin air through the sheer force of credit. A company could announce a route through a distant territory, issue millions of dollars in bonds and stocks based on the expectation of future traffic, and begin trading those securities long before a single spike was driven into the ground. This was the birth of speculative fever on a national scale. The railroad was not just a way to move freight, it was a way to move paper. As the tracks pushed westward, the frenzy moved from the boardroom to the streets. The market became a theater of pure emotion. News of a new charter or a proposed connection between lines would send stock prices into a vertical ascent, driven not by earnings or assets, but by the greater fool theory, the belief that you could always sell your overpriced shares to someone even more optimistic than yourself. This was the era of the corner, where wealthy speculators would attempt to buy up every available share of a railroad, trapping short sellers in a tightening vice of rising prices and forced liquidations. But the foundation of this empire was built on sand. The railroads were capital-intensive nightmares, requiring massive amounts of debt to fund their relentless expansion. To keep the machine running, companies began to engage in increasingly desperate accounting tricks. They issued more debt to pay the interest on old debt. They inflated their perceived value through complex subsidiary webs, and they relied on a constant, torrential influx of new investor capital to stave off insolvency. It was a high-stakes game of musical chairs, played with the fate of the American economy as the prize. The music stopped in 1873. The bubble, swollen by years of unchecked optimism and reckless leveraging, finally burst when the J. Cook and Company Bank, the primary financier of the Northern Railroads, collapsed under the weight of its own overextension. The shockwave was instantaneous. It wasn't just a market correction, it was a systemic seizure. The panic of 1873 plunged the nation into a brutal 6-year depression. Factories shuttered, unemployment soared, and the dream of westward prosperity turned into a nightmare of bankruptcy. This catastrophe revealed the dark side of the railroad era. It proved that the very infrastructure meant to unify the nation had become a primary source of its instability. The iron tracks had created a new kind of contagion, a financial virus that could jump from a single bankrupt line to the entire global banking system. As the smoke cleared from the first great railroad crash, Wall Street learned a lesson it would never truly forget. In the pursuit of progress, the line between a revolutionary industry and a catastrophic bubble is often thinner than a rail. 1890, New York City. If the panic of 1873 taught Wall Street that speculation could destroy a nation, the decade that followed taught the titans of industry how to control it. The era of the individual speculator was being eclipsed by something far more formidable, more organized, and infinitely more dangerous: the era of the trust. As the smoke from the railroad crashes cleared, a new breed of corporate predator emerged. They realized that the true source of power wasn't just the ability to gamble on a stock, but the ability to own the very market in which those stocks traded. This was the age of the trust, a legal mechanism designed to allow multiple companies to merge their interests under a single, centralized control, effectively creating a monopoly that could crush competition with surgical precision. The goal was no longer just growth, it was total dominion. In the oil fields of Pennsylvania, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil perfected this blueprint. Through a web of secret rebates with railroads and the aggressive acquisition of competitors, Standard Oil didn't just compete in the market, it became the market. By controlling the refineries, the pipelines, and the transport, Rockefeller could dictate the price of kerosene from a boardroom in Manhattan, leaving independent producers to wither or be swallowed whole. This pattern repeated across every vital artery of the American economy. In the steel industry, Andrew Carnegie's empire leveraged vertical integration to control everything from the iron ore mines to the finished beams of the nation's skyscrapers. In the sugar, tobacco, and meatpacking industries, massive combinations formed, creating invisible empires that operated beyond the reach of any state legislature or consumer voice. But the most terrifying development was not the industrial monopolies themselves, but the financial architecture that supported them. This was the rise of the money trust, a small, interlocking circle of Wall Street bankers, most notably J.P. Morgan, began to act as the ultimate architects of American capitalism. These men were more than just lenders. They were the supreme arbiters of industrial survival. Through a process known as Morganization, these bankers would step into failing industries, consolidate them, and reorganize them into stable, profitable monopolies. On the surface, it looked like salvation, a way to bring order to the chaos of the Gilded Age. But beneath the surface, it was the consolidation of absolute power. The bankers held the strings to the railroads, the steel mills, and the oil refineries. They decided which companies lived, which companies died, and which industries would be allowed to thrive. The economy was no longer a decentralized web of competing interests. It had become a centralized hierarchy. The invisible hand of the market, which Adam Smith had once described as a self-regulating force of nature, was being replaced by the very visible, very heavy hand of the trust. For the first time in history, the concentration of wealth was so extreme that it threatened the very concept of a free market. When a handful of men in Manhattan can control the price of the fuel that heats your home, the steel that builds your bridge, and the credit that fuels your business, the economy ceases to be a mechanism of public prosperity. It becomes a tool of private command. The stage was set for a collision between the unchecked might of these industrial giants and a growing, restless nation that was beginning to realize it had lost control of its own destiny. 1912, Washington, D.C. The era of the invisible empire had finally reached a breaking point. For decades, the architects of the money trust had operated in a vacuum of accountability. There was no Federal Reserve to manage the flow of credit, no Securities and Exchange Commission to police the truth of a balance sheet, and no centralized regulatory body to prevent the consolidation of entire industries into the hands of a few dozen men. Wall Street was not merely a marketplace. It was a sovereign state, operating under its own set of unwritten laws, where the line between banking and industrial dominance had effectively vanished. This vacuum of oversight created a systemic rot. Because there was no federal watchdog, the titans of finance could engage in practices that would be unthinkable in a modern regulated economy. They practiced interlocking directorates, a sophisticated form of collusion where a single man would sit on the boards of dozens of competing companies, ensuring that competition was nothing more than a theatrical illusion. They controlled the flow of capital with such absolute authority that they could effectively starve a competitor of credit, forcing them into bankruptcy before a single product was ever sold. The sheer scale of this concentration of power eventually caught the attention of the federal government. In 1912, the Pujo Committee, a subcommittee of the House Committee on Banking and Currency, was convened to investigate the very heart of this shadow empire. What they uncovered was not just a series of successful businesses, but a mathematical map of dominance. The committee's findings were chilling. They revealed that a tiny group of Wall Street bankers, centered around the House of Morgan, held a stranglehold on the nation's credit. The report estimated that the control of vast swaths of the American economy, including the nation's most vital railroads and steelworks, was concentrated in the hands of a group of men who controlled assets worth billions. This was the money trust, a web of interconnected interests that functioned as a private, unregulated central bank, deciding the economic fate of the United States behind closed doors. The Pujo Committee's testimony laid bare a terrifying reality. The American economy had become a closed loop. The bankers lent money to the industrial trusts. The industrial trusts paid interest back to the banks, and the banks used that interest to expand their control over even more industries. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of wealth that left the average citizen, the small business owner, and even the independent manufacturer completely powerless. The lack of federal oversight had turned the American dream of a competitive marketplace into a nightmare of orchestrated monopolies. The public outcry following the Pujo investigation was deafening. For the first time, the American people realized that the freedom of the market was being used as a shield to protect the interests of a financial oligarchy. The shadow of corruption had grown so long that it was beginning to eclipse the light of democracy itself. The nation was at a crossroads. It could continue to allow a handful of Manhattan elites to act as the de facto rulers of the American economy, or it could move toward a new era of intervention, regulation, and the rule of law. The tension was reaching a fever pitch, and the stability of the entire financial system hung in the balance, waiting for the next great shock to force the hand of history. October 1907, New York City. The tension that had been simmering through the Gilded Age finally boiled over, not in a courtroom, but in the streets and the teller lines of Manhattan. If the money trust was a shadow empire, the panic of 1907 was the moment the lights flickered and died, revealing how precarious that empire truly was. The spark was ignited by a failed attempt at market manipulation. Two speculators, F. Augustus Hines and Charles W. Morse, attempted to corner the stock of the United Copper Company. It was a classic Wall Street gambit, high stakes, predatory, and fueled by massive amounts of leverage. But the scheme collapsed spectacularly. As the copper stock plummeted, the contagion spread instantly. The banks and trust companies that had lent money to Hines and Morse were suddenly exposed. They were found to be holding nothing but hollow promises and devalued paper. In an era before the Federal Reserve, there was no lender of last resort. There was no central mechanism to inject liquidity into a freezing market. When the public realized that the massive trust companies, the unregulated shadow banks of the era, were sitting on piles of bad debt, panic turned into a stampede. Bank runs became the defining image of the crisis. Thousands of ordinary citizens, gripped by a primal fear, descended upon the marble lobbies of New York's financial institutions, demanding their cash. They lined up for blocks clutching passbooks, watching with terror as the heavy brass doors of the banks remained shut. The contagion was systemic. A run on one institution triggered a run on the next, creating a domino effect that threatened to pull the entire American industrial machine into the abyss. The economy didn't just slow down, it seized. Credit evaporated. The gears of commerce, the payrolls for steelworkers, the fuel for railroads, the capital for manufacturers, ground to a violent halt. The nation was staring into the eyes of a total systemic collapse. And in this moment of absolute chaos, the ultimate irony was revealed. The only force capable of stopping the bleeding was not the government, nor the law, but the very men the public had grown to distrust, the titans of the money trust. J.P. Morgan, the undisputed king of Wall Street, stepped into the vacuum. In a display of power that would be unthinkable in a modern democracy, Morgan took command of the crisis. He locked the city's leading bankers in his private library, refusing to let them out until they had agreed to a plan to pool their resources to bail out the failing institutions. He acted as a one-man central bank, deciding which banks were too important to fail and which would be allowed to perish. While Morgan's intervention arguably saved the country from a second Great Depression, the cost of the rescue was a profound loss of national sovereignty. The Panic of 1907 proved that the American economy was being held hostage by its own financial architecture. It proved that Wall Street had become so large, so interconnected, and so volatile that it could no longer be allowed to police itself. The realization was inescapable. A nation cannot leave its survival in the hands of a private club of bankers. The era of the private empire was dying, and the era of the federal regulator was about to be born. January 1920, New York City. The smoke from the Great War had cleared, and a new, intoxicating atmosphere was settling over the streets of Manhattan. The era of the private banker king, personified by J.P. Morgan, was being replaced by something far more volatile, far more widespread, and far more infectious. For the first time in American history, the gates of Wall Street were swinging open, not for the elite but for the masses. This was the dawn of the Roaring Twenties, a decade defined by a radical shift in the American psyche. The grim austerity of the war years gave way to a feverish obsession with prosperity. The industrial machine was humming at full capacity. Consumer goods were flooding the market, and the American middle class was beginning to see the fruits of a new, electrified age. But the most significant revolution wasn't happening in the factories. It was happening in the brokerage houses. Before this decade, the stock market was a private playground for the titans of industry and the heirs of the Gilded Age. Investing was a profession, a guarded secret shared by those with the capital to play the long game. But the 1920s changed the math. Technological advancements in communications, the proliferation of ticker tape, and a massive surge in financial literacy through mass media turned the stock market into a national spectator sport. Suddenly, the stock ticker wasn't just a tool for professionals. It was a pulse that every American wanted to feel. The democratization of the market began in earnest as the barrier to entry crumbled. The primary weapon of this new retail investor was margin. In an era of unprecedented liquidity, you no longer needed a fortune to own a piece of an empire. You only needed a small fraction of the price. Through margin trading, an ordinary clerk or a shopkeeper could walk into a brokerage office and buy hundreds of dollars worth of stock with only 10% of the cash in hand. The rest was borrowed from the broker, who in turn borrowed from the banks. It was a magnificent, precarious house of cards. It created a feedback loop of pure, unadulterated optimism. As prices rose, more people rushed in to buy on margin, which drove prices even higher, which lured in even more investors. The psychology of the market shifted from cautious speculation to a cult of inevitable prosperity. The prevailing wisdom was no longer about analyzing balance sheets or understanding commodity cycles. It was about the new era. The belief was that technology and mass consumption had fundamentally changed the laws of economics, rendering the old rules of boom and bust obsolete. The stock market became the heartbeat of the American dream. To own stock was to participate in the greatness of the nation. It was no longer just about wealth. It was about belonging. From the bustling sidewalks of Wall Street to the quiet suburbs of the Midwest, the siren song of easy money was everywhere. The market was no longer a distant, shadow empire controlled by a few men in a private library. It had become a democratic frenzy, a tidal wave of individual ambition that was lifting all boats, or so everyone believed. But beneath the jazz, the flapper dresses, and the soaring ticker tapes, the foundation was being built on borrowed time and borrowed money. The democratization of Wall Street had invited the entire nation to the party, but it had also ensured that when the music eventually stopped, no one would be left standing. September 1928, New York City. The fever had moved beyond mere excitement. It had become a collective delirium. By the late 1920s, the new era was no longer just a theory discussed in brokerage houses. It was a secular religion. The stock market had become the altar, and the rising ticker tape was the scripture of a new American gospel, the belief that wealth was not something to be earned through labor, but something to be captured through momentum. To understand the madness of this era, one must understand the intoxicating mechanics of the margin call. In the 1920s, the leverage available to the average citizen was nothing short of predatory. If a stock was trading at $100, a speculator could control that entire share with just $10 of their own capital. The other 90 were essentially a high-stakes bet placed on the future. This was the ultimate multiplier. In a rising market, margin trading didn't just accelerate wealth, it supercharged the human ego. An ordinary man could see his purchasing power quintuple overnight, fueling a sense of invincibility that bypassed the rational mind entirely. This created a psychological phenomenon that economists are still studying today, the decoupling of price from value. In a healthy market, a stock's price is a reflection of a company's earnings, its assets, and its future potential. But in the late 20s, the price became a reflection of nothing more than the expectation of more buying. The market had entered a self-sustaining loop of mania. Because everyone was playing with borrowed money, every minor uptick in price triggered a rush of new capital, which in turn pushed prices higher, which then signaled to the next wave of investors that the new era was real. The cult of prosperity was reinforced by a cultural landscape that equated bull markets with moral righteousness. Success in the market was seen as proof of American vitality. The skeptics, the bears who warned of overextension and irrational valuations, were not just seen as wrong, they were seen as cynics, as people who simply didn't get the new age. The media, fueled by the era's burgeoning advertising machine, played its part perfectly, painting the stock market as a ladder that any person, regardless of class, could climb to reach the heights of the aristocracy. As the decade drew to a close, the psychological landscape was one of absolute, unshakable certainty. The concept of a crash had become an impossibility in the minds of the public. They believed they had mastered the tides of capitalism. They believed they had outsmarted the gravity of economics. The widespread use of margin meant that the entire nation was now tethered to the same precarious line. The individual investor was no longer an observer of the market. They were its fuel. But leverage is a double-edged sword. While it provides a magnificent tailwind during the ascent, it turns the descent into a freefall. In a margin-driven market, a small dip in price doesn't just mean a loss of profit. It means a margin call. It means the broker demands their money immediately. And when thousands of investors are forced to sell their stocks at the exact same moment to cover their debts, the very mechanism that drove the boom becomes the engine of the catastrophe. The party was reaching its crescendo, and the air was growing thin. October 24, 1929, New York City. The end did not arrive with a single, clean break, but with a series of tremors that signaled the tectonic plates of American finance were finally shifting. On the Thursday preceding the infamous Tuesday, the market experienced its first true taste of panic. It was Black Thursday. As prices began to stutter and dip, the collective delusion of the new era was punctured by a sudden, sharp realization. The music had stopped. For a few hours, the titans of Wall Street, the Morgans and the Rockefellers, rushed to the floor to orchestrate a rescue, buying up shares to stem the bleeding and restore a semblance of order. They managed to stabilize the panic, but they had failed to fix the underlying rot. They had treated the symptom, but ignored the disease. The weekend that followed was a period of agonizing suspense. In the coffee shops of Manhattan and the parlors of Middle America, the atmosphere was thick with dread. The illusion of invincibility had been replaced by a haunting question. What happens when the money runs out? Then came Monday, October 28th. The stabilization failed. The selling pressure was no longer a trickle. It was a deluge. As the ticker tape struggled to keep up with the sheer volume of transactions, a terrifying information gap opened. Investors were making decisions in a vacuum, watching their net worth evaporate without knowing the current price of the assets they held. This was the first great failure of the era's infrastructure. A market moving at the speed of human panic, but a reporting system moving at the speed of mechanical gears. But if Monday was the warning shot, Tuesday, October 29th, was the execution. Black Tuesday was not merely a market correction, it was a systemic collapse. By the time the opening bell rang, the psychological dam had burst. The cult of prosperity had turned into a cult of survival. The frenzy of buying that had defined the decade was replaced by a singular, primal impulse to exit at any cost. There were no buyers. There were only sellers screaming into a void. The forensic reality of the crash is found in the math of the margin call. As stock prices plummeted, the brokers, who had lent out billions in borrowed capital, realized their collateral was vanishing. To protect themselves, they issued margin calls, demanding immediate cash from investors to cover their losses. But the investors had no cash. They had only more stocks, which were now worth a fraction of their previous value. This triggered a recursive loop of destruction. Selling triggered lower prices. Lower prices triggered more margin calls. More margin calls triggered more selling. It was a mathematical death spiral. By the end of the day, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had lost a staggering portion of its value. The ticker tape, once the herald of wealth, now fell like a funeral shroud across the floor of the exchange. Billions of dollars in paper wealth that had been used to fuel the consumerism of the Roaring Twenties, simply ceased to exist. The crash of 1929 was the moment the leverage that had supercharged the American dream became the weight that crushed it. The decoupling of price from value was complete, and as the dust settled on the floor of the exchange, the world realized that the new era was not a new age of prosperity, but a house of cards that had finally met the wind. November 1929, New York City. The dust from the crash had barely settled on the floor of the exchange, but the contagion was already spreading far beyond the canyons of Manhattan. For much of the decade, the American public had viewed Wall Street as a separate entity, a glittering playground for the wealthy and a high-speed engine for the middle class to build fortunes. But as the weeks turned into months, the boundary between the trading floor and the kitchen table vanished. The failure of the market was no longer just a loss of paper wealth. It was becoming a total collapse of the American lifeblood. The transmission mechanism of this catastrophe was the banking system. Throughout the 1920s, Wall Street and commercial banks had become inextricably linked. Banks had used the deposits of ordinary citizens to fuel the speculative fever, lending money to brokers and investing in the very stocks that were now cratering. When the market died, the bank's assets died with it. Suddenly, the bank run became the defining image of the era. Panic, once a psychological phenomenon on the trading floor, became a physical phenomenon on the streets. Fearing that their life savings would vanish into the void left by Wall Street, depositors rushed to their local branches, forming lines that stretched around city blocks. When a bank could not meet the demand for withdrawals, it shuttered its doors. In the months that followed, thousands of banks collapsed, taking with them the savings of millions of families who had never even owned a single share of stock. The wealth of a nation was being erased, not by a loss of value, but by a loss of trust. This was the moment the Great Crash transformed into the Great Depression. The paralysis moved through the economy like a toxin. As wealth evaporated and banks failed, consumer spending plummeted. Factories, seeing their orders vanish, began to slash production. As production fell, demand for labor evaporated. The unemployment rate, which had been negligible during the boom, began a terrifying ascent toward 25%. But the rot was not contained by the Atlantic Ocean. The global economy of 1929 was a delicate web of interconnected debts, largely forged in the aftermath of the First World War. Wall Street had become the world's creditor, pumping American capital into the rebuilding efforts of Europe. When the American engine seized, the flow of credit stopped. To protect their remaining gold reserves, nations began raising tariffs and retreating into isolationism, turning a financial crisis into a global trade war. The interconnectedness that had facilitated the prosperity of the 1920s now facilitated the synchronized misery of the 1930s. The failure of Wall Street had broken the most fundamental assumption of modern capitalism, that the system was self-correcting. Instead, the system had entered a feedback loop of contraction. Deflation set in, making debts harder to pay and making every dollar more precious even as people starved. The new era had promised a world of infinite growth through leverage. Instead, it delivered a world of infinite scarcity through collapse. The American dream had not just stalled, it had been paralyzed, leaving a generation to wander through the wreckage of a broken promise. June 1933, Washington, D.C. The wreckage of the Great Depression had become too vast for the old ways of laissez-faire capitalism to repair. For decades, the mantra of the American financial system had been buyer beware. If a company lied about its earnings, if a broker manipulated a stock, or if a bank gambled with a widow's savings, it was considered the unfortunate risk of the market. But after the systemic evaporation of life savings and the paralysis of the global economy, buyer beware was no longer a viable social contract. The American people did not just want a recovery, they demanded a reckoning. They demanded rules. The first major strike against the unchecked power of the financial titans came in the form of the Glass-Steagall Act. For years, the distinction between commercial banking and investment banking had been a ghost, a line on a map that everyone ignored. Large banks had functioned as two-headed hydras. One head held the stable, boring deposits of the working class, while the other head engaged in the high-stakes, high-octane gambling of the stock market. When the gambling side lost, it reached into the pockets of the depositors to cover its debts. Glass-Steagall was designed to perform a radical surgical separation. It mandated a firewall between the institutions that managed the nation's money and the institutions that traded its securities. The goal was simple: to ensure that the safety of a citizen's savings was never again held hostage by the volatility of the trading floor. It was a move toward stability over speculation, forcing banks to choose between being a safe harbor for capital or a vessel for risk. It was the end of the era of the all-purpose financial behemoth. But separating the banks was only half the battle. Even with the firewalls in place, the market itself remained a dark room where most participants were flying blind. The 1920s had been defined by information asymmetry, where the insiders knew the truth and the public knew only the hype. To fix this, the Roosevelt administration realized they needed a permanent watchdog. They needed a way to shine a light into the shadows of the exchange. Enter the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC. Established by the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, the SEC was more than just a new agency. It was a new philosophy. It shifted the burden of truth from the investor to the issuer. For the first time, companies were legally required to provide full, truthful, and standardized disclosures about their financial health. If you wanted to sell a stock to the public, you had to show your books. Transparency was no longer a courtesy, it was a mandate. The SEC was given the power to regulate brokerage firms, oversee stock exchanges, and prosecute those who engaged in market manipulation. It was the birth of the referee in the game of capitalism. Together, Glass-Steagall and the creation of the SEC represented a fundamental restructuring of the American economic DNA. They were the pillars of a new architecture, designed to rebuild the broken bridge of trust between the people and the markets. Wall Street was no longer a lawless frontier. It was becoming a regulated institution. The era of the Wild West was closing, and the era of the regulated machine had begun. December 1941, Washington, D.C. The new regulatory architecture of the SEC and the firewall of Glass-Steagall had begun to take root, but the stability they provided was about to be tested by a crisis unlike any the world had ever seen. The Great Depression had been a crisis of collapse. World War II would be a crisis of unprecedented demand. As the shadows of global conflict lengthened, the United States faced a terrifying mathematical reality. The cost of modern, mechanized warfare was astronomical, and the government could not pay for it through taxes alone. The nation needed a way to bridge the gap between its vast industrial ambitions and its limited liquid capital. The solution would not come from the speculative fever of the 1920s, but from a disciplined, orchestrated mobilization of the American people's savings. This was the era of the war bond. War bonds represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between the citizen, the state, and the financial markets. Unlike the volatile stocks of the previous decade, which promised dizzying returns and carried the risk of total loss, war bonds were a promise of stability. They were an invitation for the average American, the factory worker, the teacher, the farmer, to become a direct financier of the Allied cause. By purchasing these bonds, citizens weren't just helping to fund tanks, aircraft, and munitions. They were effectively lending their capital to the government in exchange for a guaranteed return. For Wall Street, this was a period of strange, forced discipline. The era of the high-flying speculator was temporarily eclipsed by the era of the patriotic creditor. The financial machinery of the country was redirected toward a single, monumental goal: liquidity for the war effort. The Treasury Department, working in tandem with major banks and brokerage firms, launched massive propaganda campaigns to turn the act of saving into a civic duty. The message was clear. To invest in a bond was to fight on the front lines from the home front. This massive influx of capital served a dual purpose. First, it provided the immense funding necessary to fuel the arsenal of democracy. Second, and perhaps more importantly for the long-term health of the global economy, it acted as a massive sponge, soaking up excess liquidity that might otherwise have fueled a post-war inflationary spiral. By encouraging citizens to lock their money away in long-term government debt, the state effectively managed the money supply, preventing the kind of runaway inflation that often follows a massive surge in industrial production. As the war progressed, this process achieved something remarkable. It stabilized the American dollar. The sheer scale of the bond programs helped cement the dollar's reliability on the global stage. It proved that the American financial system could be mobilized not just for private profit, but for national survival. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, the landscape of finance had been irrevocably altered. The United States emerged from the conflict not as a nation recovering from a breakdown, but as the world's undisputed economic superpower. The dollar was no longer just a local currency. It was the bedrock of a new international order. The war had taken the regulated machine built during the New Deal and turned it into a global engine of stability, setting the stage for a post-war era of unprecedented prosperity. 1945, New York City. The smoke of the Second World War had cleared, leaving behind a global landscape of ruin. But in the United States, the horizon looked nothing like the devastation seen in Europe or the Pacific. While much of the world was struggling to rebuild from zero, America was standing atop a mountain of industrial capacity, a massive surplus of trained workers, and crucially, a population that had spent years learning how to save, how to invest, and how to participate in a national economic mission. The transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime one could have been catastrophic. The sudden cessation of government spending and the return of millions of soldiers to the civilian workforce posed a massive risk of unemployment and stagnation. Instead, the opposite occurred. We entered an era of the Great Compression, a period where the gap between the ultra-wealthy and the working class narrowed, and the American middle class began to expand at a rate never before seen in human history. This was the birth of the modern consumer. For the first time, the fruits of industrial productivity were not just flowing upward to the titans of industry, but outward to the suburbs. The GI Bill provided the fuel for this expansion, offering veterans access to higher education and low-interest mortgages. As these veterans moved into the newly minted suburbs, they brought with them a new kind of economic demand. They didn't just need bread and milk. They needed cars, televisions, washing machines, and refrigerators. Wall Street, once a place defined by the frantic, often predatory speculation of the 1920s, found itself adapting to this new, massive, and remarkably stable engine of growth. The focus shifted from the get-rich-quick schemes of the individual speculator to the get-rich-slow stability of the institutional investor. The prosperity of the middle class was being fueled by a cycle of consumption and credit. To buy a home in Levittown or a Cadillac in the driveway, Americans needed loans. To fund the corporations making these goods, companies needed capital. This created a symbiotic, if complex, relationship between the kitchen table and the trading floor. The massive demand for consumer goods drove corporate profits to record highs, which in turn drove stock prices upward. As the middle class grew, so did the pool of potential investors. The stock market was no longer just a playground for the elite in silk hats. It was becoming an integral part of the American dream. To own a piece of the company that made your car, or the utility company that powered your new suburban home, became a mark of participation in the nation's success. However, this prosperity was built on a delicate architecture of credit and confidence. The era of consumerism was predicated on the idea that the future would always be better than the present. That growth was not just possible, but inevitable. This psychological shift was profound. The fear that had gripped the nation during the Great Depression was being replaced by a relentless, optimistic drive toward more. As the 1950s dawned, Wall Street was no longer just managing the wealth of the few. It was beginning to manage the aspirations of the many. The American economy had become a massive, self-reinforcing loop of production, consumption, and investment. But as this engine roared to life, it was also setting the stage for a new kind of dominance, a world where the American dollar would not just lead the domestic market, but would dictate the rules of the entire planet. July 1944, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. While the guns were still firing across the Atlantic, the architects of the post-war world were meeting in a quiet, mountainous retreat to solve a problem that had crippled the globe only 2 decades prior: economic chaos. The Great Depression had not been caused solely by a stock market crash. It had been exacerbated by a beggar-thy-neighbor cycle of competitive devaluations, where nations slashed the value of their currencies to gain an unfair advantage in trade, effectively tearing the fabric of international commerce apart. The delegates from 44 nations arrived with a singular, daunting mission: to design a financial system that could ensure stability, prevent another depression, and facilitate the reconstruction of a broken world. They weren't just looking for a truce, they were looking for a foundation. The centerpiece of this new architecture was not a treaty, but a standard. At the heart of the negotiations was a fundamental question: what would anchor the world's wealth? The answer was the United States dollar. Under the newly minted Bretton Woods system, a new hierarchy was established. The world would move away from the chaotic fluctuations of the gold standard of old and toward a gold exchange standard. The rules were precise and powerful. The US dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Every other major currency in the world would then be pegged to the dollar. This transformed the greenback from a national currency into the world's reserve currency. It meant that if a merchant in London wanted to buy oil from the Middle East, or a factory in France wanted to import machinery from Japan, they wouldn't necessarily need gold. They would need dollars. The dollar became the universal language of value, the ultimate medium of exchange, and the bedrock upon which all international trade would be built. For Wall Street, this was a tectonic shift. The American financial markets were no longer just the engine of the domestic economy. They were becoming the clearinghouse for the entire planet. As foreign central banks began accumulating massive reserves of US dollars to maintain their own exchange rates, that capital inevitably flowed through the pipes of New York's financial institutions. The demand for American assets, treasury bonds, corporate equities, and industrial capital skyrocketed. This system provided the golden age with its most essential ingredient, predictability. For the first time in history, a corporation could plan a 10-year expansion project knowing that the currency they earned abroad wouldn't vanish into a vacuum of devaluation by next Tuesday. This stability fueled the very consumerism we saw rising in the American suburbs. It allowed for the long-term financing of the ships, the planes, and the factories that defined the mid-century era. But this dominance came with a profound responsibility and a hidden vulnerability. By making the dollar the world's anchor, the United States assumed the role of the world's central banker. The stability of the global economy was now inextricably linked to the fiscal health and the political will of a single nation. The world was now riding on the strength of the American promise. And as Wall Street began to manage this unprecedented global flow of capital, it was beginning to realize that the dollar wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the most powerful instrument of influence ever devised. January 1950, Lower Manhattan, New York City. As the global economy settled into the rhythmic, predictable pulse of the Bretton Woods era, the skyline of New York began to change. The grit of the industrial age was being replaced by the polished marble and soaring steel of a new kind of temple, the institutional investment bank. This was the dawn of the Golden Age, and at its center sat a model of finance that would seem almost prehistoric to the high-frequency traders of the future. It was the era of relationship banking. In this period, Wall Street was not a place of anonymous algorithms or lightning-fast digital executions. It was a place of handshakes, mahogany desks, and deep, multi-generational connections. If you were a CEO of a burgeoning manufacturing giant or a shipping magnate, you didn't go to a website to find capital. You went to a person. You went to a partner at a firm like Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs, men who knew your father, knew your board of directors, and knew your reputation. Under the protective shadow of the Glass-Steagall Act, the lines of finance were clearly drawn. Commercial banks held the deposits of the public, while investment banks handled the complex machinery of capital markets. Because of this separation, investment banks focused on a very specific, highly curated clientele. They weren't looking for millions of retail investors. They were looking for the blue-chip elite. The business model was built on intimacy and trust. An investment banker in the 1950s acted as a sophisticated intermediary, a bridge between the massive pools of corporate capital and the industrial giants that needed it to expand. If a company wanted to issue new bonds to build a new factory in the Midwest, or if they wanted to take their company public via an initial public offering, they relied on the relationship. The banker didn't just provide the math. They provided the credibility. Their seal of approval was the ultimate signal to the market that a venture was sound. This era was defined by a sense of stewardship. Because the players were few and the stakes were personal, there was an implicit understanding that stability was more valuable than volatility. The goal wasn't to game the market or exploit a momentary fluctuation. The goal was to facilitate the long-term growth of the American industrial machine. Profits were steady, dividends were consistent, and the culture was one of professional decorum and extreme discretion. In these wood-paneled offices, the gentlemanly banker became a cultural icon. These were the architects of the post-war boom, ensuring that the capital flowing through the New York pipes was directed toward the steel mills, the automotive plants, and the aerospace innovators that were making America the undisputed economic superpower. However, this model relied on a very specific set of conditions: a regulated market, a stable dollar, and a relatively small number of powerful actors. It was a closed loop, an elite club where information was passed through whispers in private clubs rather than data feeds. It was a system built on the assumption that the world would always remain this orderly. But as the 1960s progressed, the rigid boundaries of relationship banking would begin to face the pressures of a world that was growing too large, too fast, and too complex to be managed by a handshake alone. October 1973, Lower Manhattan, New York City. The mahogany desks and quiet discretion of the Golden Age were about to be shattered. The orderly, predictable world of relationship banking, a world built on the assumption of steady growth and a rock-solid dollar, was colliding with a new, chaotic reality. The closed loop of the post-war era was breaking, and the cracks were appearing in the form of a phenomenon that economists had previously thought impossible. It was called stagflation, a portmanteau of stagnation and inflation. It was a toxic economic cocktail that defied the traditional rules of finance. Usually when an economy slows down, inflation drops. Usually when inflation rises, the economy is overheating. But in the 1970s, the gears of the American machine jammed. Prices were skyrocketing, yet growth was flatlining and unemployment was climbing. For the institutional titans of Wall Street, the math they had relied on for decades was no longer working. The catalyst for this descent into chaos was not found on a trading floor, but in the sands of the Middle East. In 1973, the OPEC oil embargo struck the West like a sledgehammer. As oil prices quadrupled overnight, the cost of doing business across every sector of the American economy surged. Transportation became expensive, manufacturing became inefficient, and the consumer, once the engine of prosperity, found their purchasing power evaporating in real time. This was more than just a supply shock. It was a fundamental breakdown of the global monetary order. The Bretton Woods system, which had tethered the world's currencies to the US dollar, and the dollar itself, which was tied to gold, had already begun to fray. As the era of fixed exchange rates collapsed, the stability that the gentlemanly banker relied upon vanished. The dollar was no longer an anchor, it was adrift. On the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the atmosphere shifted from one of stewardship to one of survival. The predictable dividends and steady climbs of the 1950s were replaced by violent, unpredictable swings. Investors were no longer looking for long-term growth. They were looking for a way to outrun the eroding value of their own cash. Inflation was eating the market alive. The social contract of the post-war era was unraveling. The middle class, which had been the beneficiary of the era of relationship banking, saw their savings lose value while the cost of living soared. The sense of institutional trust, the belief that the architects of finance could manage the world's capital with decorum and foresight, was being replaced by a growing cynicism. Wall Street was entering a dark decade. The era of the gentlemanly banker was dying, suffocated by the twin pressures of skyrocketing energy costs and a runaway currency. The old order, built on the pillars of stability and slow, deliberate expansion, was being dismantled by forces that no handshake or private club meeting could contain. The world was becoming faster, more volatile, and far more dangerous. The stage was being set for a radical, aggressive restructuring of the financial world, a restructuring that would eventually demand a much more ruthless kind of player. August 1979, Washington, D.C. The era of the gentlemanly banker had not just faded, it had been incinerated. By the late 1970s, the American economy was in a state of freefall. Inflation had become a psychological monster, a runaway beast that people expected to grow every single day. It reached double digits, then surged toward 15%, and eventually it threatened to become permanent. The dollar was losing its meaning, and with it, the very foundation of global trade. The presidency of Jimmy Carter was defined by this creeping paralysis, but the solution would not come from the White House. It would come from the Federal Reserve. In August of 1979, Paul Volcker was appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve. He was not a man of consensus or soft diplomacy. He was a scholar of monetary theory, a man who understood that you cannot negotiate with an inflationary spiral. You can only break it. Volcker looked at the wreckage of the 1970s and realized that the traditional tools of interest rate management were no longer enough. To kill the inflation monster, he would have to starve it. He initiated what would become known as the Volcker shock. It was a move of surgical, almost brutal precision. Instead of merely trying to nudge interest rates upward, Volcker shifted the Fed's focus toward strictly controlling the money supply. The result was a tectonic shift in the cost of capital. Interest rates, which had previously been manageable, began to skyrocket. By 1981, the federal funds rate peaked at an unprecedented 20%. To the titans of Wall Street, this was an economic earthquake. Think of the implications. If you wanted to buy a home, a car, or build a factory, the cost of borrowing had just become astronomical. The sudden scarcity of money sent shockwaves through every corner of the financial ecosystem. The stock market, already reeling from the decade's volatility, buckled under the weight of these rates. High-growth companies, reliant on cheap credit to expand, saw their valuations evaporate. Real estate markets froze. But the shockwave extended far beyond the trading floors of Lower Manhattan. It hit the Main Street economy with devastating force. As interest rates climbed, the cost of servicing debt became unbearable for farmers, small businesses, and families alike. The United States plunged into a deep, painful recession. Unemployment surged, and the social fabric of the nation felt the strain of a tightening monetary vice. Critics called Volcker a butcher. They argued that he was sacrificing the American worker on the altar of monetary stability. There were protests, political fury, and a sense that the central bank had turned its back on the people to protect the sanctity of the dollar. Yet Volcker remained unmoved. He understood a cold, mathematical truth. If the inflation wasn't broken now, the entire global financial system would eventually collapse into hyperinflationary chaos. The shock worked. It was a period of intense grinding pain, but by the mid-1980s the inflation monster had been tamed. The fever had broken. However, the cost of this victory changed Wall Street forever. The era of easy growth was over. In its place emerged a new, colder reality, an era where capital was expensive, where risk was calculated with ruthless precision, and where the era of financialization was about to begin. The shock had cleared the ground, making way for a much more aggressive breed of financier. 1981, New York City. The smoke from the stagflation fires had cleared, but the landscape left behind was unrecognizable. For a century, the fundamental purpose of Wall Street had been clear. It was a service industry for the real economy. Banks and investment houses existed to provide the fuel, the capital, that allowed companies to build bridges, manufacture automobiles, and refine steel. In this traditional model, money was a tool, a means to an end. The end goal was always the thing, the tangible product, the physical infrastructure, the goods that moved across oceans. But as the 1980s dawned, a profound and perhaps irreversible metamorphosis began to take place. The focus of the world's most powerful financial center began to pivot. It was no longer just about helping companies make things. It was about the art of moving, manipulating, and extracting value from money itself. This was the dawn of financialization. In the old world, a corporation was a producer. In the new world, a corporation was increasingly viewed as a collection of cash flows to be optimized. The rise of the shareholder value doctrine changed the very DNA of American business. Management was no longer judged solely by the quality of their product or the strength of their workforce, but by the quarterly earnings report and the movement of their stock price. This shift transformed the nature of Wall Street's players. The gentlemanly banker, who relied on long-term relationships and industry expertise, was being superseded by a new breed of operative, the arbitrageur, the speculator, and the strategist. These were men and women who viewed the world not in terms of factories and freight, but in terms of spreads, yields, and derivatives. They weren't looking at what a company did. They were looking at how the idea of that company could be sliced, diced, and traded in 1,000 different ways. As capital became more mobile and more sophisticated, the financial sector began to grow at a rate that far outpaced the rest of the economy. We began to see a decoupling. The paper economy began to drift away from the real economy. While manufacturing sectors in the Midwest were struggling with automation and global competition, the financial services sector was exploding, fueled by new technologies and a relentless drive for efficiency. The tools of this new era were mathematical and abstract. If you could turn a mortgage into a bond, and then turn that bond into a complex derivative, you had created a layer of abstraction between the investor and the actual house being lived in. Money was no longer just the grease in the gears of industry. Money was becoming the engine itself. This was the great redirection of American capitalism. The center of gravity was shifting from the factory floor to the trading floor. It promised unprecedented liquidity and efficiency, suggesting that capital could be deployed with surgical precision to wherever it was most productive. But it also planted a dangerous seed, the idea that the movement of numbers on a screen was more important than the stability of the world those numbers represented. As the 1980s progressed, the line between making money and moving money didn't just blur, it vanished entirely. The stage was set for a new era of unprecedented excess, where the pursuit of profit would no longer be tethered to the production of goods, but to the mastery of complexity itself. 1981, Washington, D.C. While the tectonic plates of finance were shifting in New York, the political earthquake that would cement this new reality was being triggered in the nation's capital. The inauguration of Ronald Reagan signaled more than just a change in administration. It signaled a fundamental change in the philosophy of American governance. The doctrine was clear. The government was no longer the referee of the market, but its greatest obstacle. This was the era of supply-side economics, a movement built on the belief that by slashing taxes and stripping away the red tape of federal oversight, the engines of private enterprise would roar back to life. For Wall Street, this was a clarion call. The regulatory frameworks born from the ashes of the Great Depression, the very guardrails designed to prevent the reckless speculation of the 1920s, were suddenly recast as shackles on American prosperity. Under the Reagan administration, the philosophy of deregulation began to sweep through the financial corridors. The idea was simple. If you give the players more freedom, they will play harder, and the entire economy will rise on their shoulders. Agencies that had spent decades monitoring capital flows and protecting consumers found their budgets slashed and their authority questioned. The walls that had separated different types of financial activity began to crumble, piece by piece. The distinction between the conservative, cautious world of commercial banking and the high-stakes, high-octane world of investment banking was no longer seen as a safety measure, but as an inefficiency to be corrected. As the government stepped back, a new cultural zeitgeist stepped forward to fill the vacuum. If the previous decades had been defined by a sense of collective duty and institutional stability, the 1980s were defined by the individual. This was the era of the yuppie, the young urban professional, and a relentless, unapologetic pursuit of personal wealth. The ethos of the decade was distilled into a single, provocative sentiment, famously immortalized by the character Gordon Gekko in the 1987 film Wall Street. Greed is good. To some, this wasn't a confession of immorality, but a celebration of the purest form of capitalism. They argued that self-interest was the most efficient driver of progress, that the desire to accumulate wealth was the ultimate incentive for innovation and hard work. In this new moral landscape, the pursuit of profit was decoupled from traditional notions of social responsibility. Success was no longer measured by what you contributed to your community, but by the size of your bonus and the speed of your climb up the corporate ladder. This cultural shift transformed the trading floors of Manhattan into gladiatorial arenas. The pursuit of the big score became a way of life. The era of the gentlemanly banker was officially dead, replaced by a culture of high-octane aggression, where the goal was to win at any cost. It was a world of power suits, champagne lunches, and a belief that the market was an infallible god that rewarded the bold and punished the hesitant. But as the deregulation continued to peel back the layers of oversight, and as the greed is good mantra became the unofficial creed of the financial elite, the system was becoming increasingly untethered. The speed of capital was accelerating, the complexity of its instruments was growing, and the safety nets were being dismantled. The stage was being set for a period of unprecedented prosperity. But beneath the surface, the foundations of the global economy were being rewired for a type of volatility the world had never seen before. 1982, New York City. While the shouting traders and the greed is good culture dominated the headlines, a silent revolution was brewing in the quiet, air-conditioned backrooms of Manhattan's elite hedge funds and emerging mathematical boutiques. If the 1980s was the decade of the predator, A new species was beginning to emerge, one that didn't rely on charisma, intuition, or the gut feeling of a seasoned floor trader. This was the era of the quant. For over a century, Wall Street had been a game of human judgment. It was a world of tape readers who could sense a shift in momentum by the rhythm of the ticker, and relationship bankers who closed deals over scotch and handshakes. Success was an art form, often driven by the ability to read the psychology of the crowd. But as the Reagan-era deregulation accelerated the pace of capital, the human brain was beginning to hit its biological limit. The markets were moving too fast, the data was becoming too vast, and the patterns were becoming too subtle for even the sharpest trader to catch in real time. Enter the mathematicians, the physicists, and the computer scientists. These were the quants, short for quantitative analysts. They didn't care about the pedigree of a CEO or the charisma of a tycoon. To them, the market wasn't a battlefield of personalities. It was a massive, chaotic, and beautiful data set waiting to be decoded. They viewed price movements not as human emotion, but as stochastic processes, random variables that could be modeled, predicted, and exploited through the cold, impartial lens of calculus and statistics. At firms like Renaissance Technologies and various emerging quant desks at major banks, these outsiders began to build the first sophisticated algorithmic models. They utilized black box strategies, proprietary mathematical formulas that could execute trades based on minute discrepancies in price, volume, or volatility. While the traditional trader was busy scanning the floor for a signal, the quant's machine was already scanning thousands of data points per second, identifying arbitrage opportunities that existed for only a fraction of a heartbeat. This was a fundamental shift in the DNA of finance. The edge was no longer found in a secret tip or a superior network. The edge was found in the elegance of an equation. The arrival of the quants signaled the beginning of the financialization of mathematics. It turned the pursuit of profit into an engineering problem. However, this transition was not without friction. The old guard of Wall Street viewed these mathematicians with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. To the veteran traders, these calculators in ties were outsiders who didn't understand the soul of the market. They believed that you couldn't boil human greed and fear down to a string of code. But the math was proving harder to ignore than the skeptics. As these algorithms began to demonstrate their ability to generate consistent, massive returns, the gravity of the industry began to shift. The power was migrating from the loud, sweating men on the trading floor to the silent, humming servers in the basement. The era of human intuition was being eclipsed by the era of the algorithm, setting the stage for a market that was faster, more efficient, and infinitely more complex, and arguably much more dangerous. 1984, Manhattan. If the rise of the quants represented a revolution of the mind, a parallel revolution was tearing through the very fabric of the American corporation. While mathematicians were busy decoding the rhythm of the ticker, a new breed of predator was prowling the boardrooms of the Fortune 500. They weren't looking for patterns in data. They were looking for vulnerabilities in balance sheets. This was the era of the leveraged buyout, or LBO, and the rise of the corporate raider. For decades, the relationship between a company and its shareholders was one of relative stability. Corporations were seen as institutions, long-term entities built to endure. But in the mid-1980s, that stability was shattered by a radical new philosophy. The idea that a company's primary purpose was not to build products or provide jobs, but to maximize immediate shareholder value. To the corporate raider, a massive, successful corporation was often nothing more than a collection of undervalued assets waiting to be unlocked. The mechanics of this new warfare were as aggressive as the men who waged it. The LBO was a financial maneuver that allowed an investor to acquire a company using a staggering amount of borrowed money. The twist: the debt used to buy the company was secured by the company's own assets. In essence, the raider was using the target's own credit card to purchase itself. Once the takeover was complete, the goal was to strip the company of its excess cash, sell off its non-core divisions, and use the remaining cash flow to pay down the massive mountain of debt used to acquire it. This was hostile in the truest sense of the word. These weren't friendly mergers discussed over lunch. These were blitzkrieg attacks. Raiders like Carl Icahn and T. Boone Pickens used tender offers, direct appeals to shareholders to bypass the board of directors, and proxy fights to seize control of companies against the explicit wishes of their management. To the CEOs of the era, these men were vultures, scavengers circling the dying giants of American industry. To the raiders, they were the ultimate disciplinarians, weeding out lazy management and forcing efficiency through the sheer pressure of debt. The cultural icon of this era was embodied by the barbarians at the gate, the high-stakes battle for RJR Nabisco. It was a spectacle of unprecedented excess, characterized by massive bonuses, champagne-soaked celebrations, and a level of greed that seemed to defy gravity. The LBO era turned the corporate world into a high-stakes poker game. It proved that size and history provided no protection. If a company's stock price was low enough and its assets were tangible enough, it was merely a target. The impact was transformative. The LBO era forced a massive wave of consolidation across the economy, as companies scrambled to become too large or too complex to be easily swallowed. It instilled a permanent sense of anxiety in the American boardroom, fundamentally changing the relationship between management and capital. But it also left behind a trail of restructured, leaner, but often hollowed-out companies. The era of the raider had proven that in the new Wall Street, the most dangerous thing a company could be was undervalued. October 19, 1987, Manhattan. If the era of the corporate raider was defined by the aggression of men, the following months would be defined by the cold, unblinking speed of machines. The stage had been set by a decade of unprecedented growth, fueled by the very quants we have just discussed. For years, the market had felt invincible. The logic was simple. Technology was making markets more efficient, more liquid, and more profitable. But as the summer of 1987 faded, a subtle, systemic rot began to settle into the digital architecture of the exchanges. The tension began to build in the weeks leading up to October. Inflation was creeping up, the dollar was weakening, and trade deficits were widening. Investors grew nervous. But in the modern era, nervousness isn't just a feeling shared by humans on a trading floor. It is a signal processed by algorithms. On the morning of Monday, October 19th, the signal turned into a scream. When the opening bell rang, the descent was not a gradual slide, but a vertical drop. The Dow Jones Industrial Average began to hemorrhage value at a pace that defied human comprehension. Within hours, it would lose 22.6% of its value, the largest single-day percentage collapse in the history of the market. To understand why this happened, You have to look beneath the surface of the panic. This wasn't just a psychological breakdown, it was a mechanical failure. The culprit was a relatively new phenomenon known as program trading. In the years prior, large institutional investors had begun using sophisticated computer models to execute portfolio insurance. The idea was supposed to be a safety net. If stock prices fell to a certain level, the computers would automatically trigger the sale of index futures to hedge against further losses. It was designed to prevent a crash by providing a controlled exit. Instead, it became a feedback loop of pure destruction. As prices began to dip, the computers triggered sell orders. These sell orders drove prices down further. As prices dropped, the computers saw a new threshold being hit, triggering even more massive sell orders. It was a digital cascade, a domino effect where the machines were knocking each other over at millisecond speeds. The human traders on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange were paralyzed. They were watching the ticker tapes, but the tapes couldn't keep up. The information lag created a vacuum of terror. By the time a human could process that a stock had dropped $10, the computer had already sold it at 5. The liquidity that the quants had promised, the ability to buy and sell instantly, evaporated exactly when it was needed most. The market didn't just crash, it seized up. Black Monday was a traumatic reckoning. It was the moment the financial world realized that the marriage of high finance and high technology had created a monster that no one truly controlled. The machines had introduced a new kind of volatility, a systemic, automated contagion that could bypass human reason entirely. In the aftermath, the Federal Reserve stepped in to provide liquidity, preventing a total collapse of the banking system, and the industry scrambled to implement circuit breakers, automatic pauses designed to let humans catch their breath. But the genie was out of the bottle. The crash proved that in the new Wall Street, the greatest risk wasn't just a bad investment or a greedy CEO. It was the terrifying, invisible speed of the algorithm. November 12, 1999, Washington, D.C. If Black Monday was a warning shot from the machines, the response from the architects of the system was not to tighten the reins, but to tear down the fences. For 66 years, a fundamental wall had stood between two different worlds of finance. This wall was the Glass-Steagall Act, a piece of emergency legislation born from the ashes of the Great Depression. It was designed to ensure that the money people kept in their savings accounts, the bedrock of the American economy, was never used to gamble on the volatile, high-stakes theater of the stock market. The logic of Glass-Steagall was simple. Commercial banks were meant to be boring. They were the utility companies of finance, providing loans and holding deposits. Investment banks, on the other hand, were the speculators, the risk-takers, the architects of IPOs and mergers. By keeping them separate, the government hoped to prevent a repeat of 1929, where banks had lost everything by playing the market with their depositors' life savings. But by the late 1990s, that wall was no longer seen as a safeguard. It was viewed by the titans of Wall Street as an obsolete relic. The narrative in the halls of Congress and the boardrooms of Manhattan had shifted. The argument, pushed aggressively by lobbyists and fueled by the greed is good ethos of the era, was one of competitiveness. Proponents argued that American banks were being handicapped in a globalizing world. If European and Japanese banks could offer both commercial and investment services under one roof, why couldn't American firms? They argued that modern finance required synergy, a polite word for the ability to use a bank's massive capital base to fuel its aggressive trading desks. The momentum became an unstoppable tide. Regulators had already begun chipping away at the edges of the law through various loopholes, effectively turning the wall into a sieve. Finally, in November 1999, President Bill Clinton signed the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act into law. The effect was instantaneous and transformative. The lines between commercial and investment banking didn't just blur, they evaporated. Suddenly, the distinction between a safe bank and a risky bank vanished. Giant financial supermarkets began to emerge, superentities that could take a customer's mortgage, bundle it into a complex security, sell it to an investor, and trade it on a high-frequency algorithm, all within the same building. The separation of powers that had defined the post-Depression era was gone. This wasn't just a change in corporate structure. It was a fundamental shift in the DNA of risk. When you merge the stability of commercial banking with the volatility of investment banking, you create a new kind of institution, one that is too big to fail. These new behemoths were now so interconnected, so massive, and so deeply woven into the fabric of every household's finances, that their potential collapse no longer just threatened Wall Street. It threatened the very survival of the global economy. The repeal of Glass-Steagall was the final removal of the safety valves. The fences were down, the markets were wide open, and the stage was set for a new era of financial engineering, one that would soon turn the pursuit of profit into a global catastrophe. 2003, Manhattan, New York. With the regulatory fences dismantled, the giants of Wall Street were no longer content with just managing money. They wanted to manufacture it. The new financial supermarkets needed fuel to drive their massive engines of growth, and they found it in a sector that had long been considered mundane, local, and, most importantly, safe: the American housing market. For decades, a mortgage was a simple contract. A person went to a local bank, proved they could pay, and the bank held that risk on its own books for 30 years. But in the new era of financialization, holding risk was seen as an inefficiency. The goal was no longer to manage risk, but to sell it. This gave birth to the subprime engine. It began with a process called securitization. Investment banks began buying thousands of individual mortgages and bundling them together into a single financial product known as a mortgage-backed security, or MBS. To the outside observer, these bundles looked like a brilliant way to spread risk. The logic was that while one person might default on their home, it was statistically impossible for thousands of people across the country to default all at once. But the hunger for these securities was insatiable. As the pool of high-quality, reliable mortgages began to shrink, the engine began to demand lower-grade fuel. This was the birth of the subprime mortgage, loans given to borrowers with poor credit, unstable income, or little to no down payment. These were the junk loans, the high-risk gambles. To hide the rot within these bundles, Wall Street turned to the dark arts of mathematical engineering. If a bundle of subprime loans was too risky to sell, why not slice it up? Enter the collateralized debt obligation, or CDO. Quantitative analysts, the quants who had become the new high priests of the trading floor, created a complex hierarchy of risk. They would take a massive pile of subprime mortgages and divide them into tranches. The top tranches were labeled AAA, the highest, safest rating possible, suggesting they were as secure as government bonds. The theory was that even if some of the underlying loans failed, the top layer was protected by the layers below it. It was a feat of mathematical alchemy, turning leaden, high-risk debt into golden, investment-grade securities. Credit rating agencies, often paid by the very banks whose products they were grading, fueled the fire by slapping these AAA stamps on almost everything. This created a feedback loop of delusion. Because these derivatives were perceived as safe, pension funds, insurance companies, and sovereign wealth funds rushed to buy them by the billions. As the demand for these securities skyrocketed, the demand for mortgages skyrocketed with it. This drove home prices to unprecedented heights, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of prosperity. Everyone felt wealthy because their home value was rising, and everyone felt safe because their investments were rated. But the engine was built on a foundation of sand. The complexity of these derivatives had become so profound that no one, not the bankers, not the regulators, and certainly not the investors, truly understood how interconnected the risks had become. The system had become a labyrinth of debt, where the appearance of safety was being used to mask a mounting, systemic fragility. The engine was running at redline, fueled by bad debt and disguised by complex math, spinning faster and faster toward a breaking point that the world was not prepared to face. September 15, 2008, Manhattan, New York. The breaking point had arrived. The mathematical alchemy that had once turned junk debt into gold was suddenly revealed for what it truly was: a house of cards. The illusion of safety shattered when housing prices, which had been rising for decades, finally began to crater. As defaults on subprime mortgages spiked, the AAA rated securities that sat at the heart of global portfolios began to lose value at a terrifying velocity. The contagion was instantaneous. Because these toxic assets had been sliced, diced, and sold into every corner of the global financial system, the failure of the underlying mortgages didn't just affect local homeowners. It threatened the very solvency of the world's most powerful institutions. For months, the air in the boardrooms of Wall Street had been thick with panic. Major players were scrambling, desperately seeking liquidity and praying for a rescue. Then came the morning that changed everything. Lehman Brothers, a titan of investment banking with a 158-year history, was declared bankrupt. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated systemic shock. The collapse of Lehman was not just the death of a single firm. It was a signal to the world that the too-big-to-fail doctrine had limits. The market assumed the government would step in, but when the music stopped, the safety net was nowhere to be found. The sudden disappearance of Lehman from the financial landscape sent a wave of terror through the global credit markets. Banks, terrified that their counterparts might be the next to fall, stopped lending to one another. The gears of global commerce, which rely entirely on the fluid movement of credit, ground to a violent, screeching halt. The shadow of the credit crunch loomed over the planet. If banks wouldn't lend to each other, they wouldn't lend to businesses. If businesses couldn't access credit, they couldn't pay employees or buy inventory. The financial meltdown was rapidly morphing into a global economic catastrophe. In the halls of power, the realization was grim. The world was staring into a dark abyss. This wasn't just a market correction or a typical recession. This was a systemic seizure. The interconnectedness that Wall Street had spent decades perfecting had become its greatest vulnerability. A single failure in a subprime mortgage in a suburb in Nevada had triggered a chain reaction that threatened to topple the entire edifice of modern capitalism. As the Dow Jones plummeted and global markets bled red, the question was no longer about profit or loss. It was about survival. The era of unchecked mathematical complexity and unregulated expansion had reached its logical, devastating conclusion. The engine had not just stalled, it had exploded, leaving the global economy in a state of wreckage. The world watched, breathless, as the architects of this chaos scrambled to contain the fire. The era of the subprime engine was over, but the era of the Great Reset was just beginning. The stage was set for a confrontation between the fury of the public and the power of the state, as the fallout of the Lehman collapse forced a fundamental reckoning with how the world's money was managed, protected, and ultimately saved. October 3, 2008, Washington, D.C. The atmosphere in the halls of Congress was not one of triumph, but of desperation. The contagion that had begun on the trading floors of lower Manhattan had successfully jumped the Potomac. The contagion was no longer just a financial crisis. It was a systemic seizure that threatened to paralyze the American economy. To prevent a total meltdown, the United States government was forced to do the unthinkable. It had to step in and save the very institutions that had ignited the fire. This was the birth of the bailout era. The centerpiece of this rescue was the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. It was a massive, unprecedented injection of taxpayer capital, hundreds of billions of dollars, designed to fortify the balance sheets of the world's largest banks. The logic presented by Treasury officials and Federal Reserve architects was grim and pragmatic. These institutions were too big to fail. They were so deeply woven into the fabric of global commerce that their collapse would not just cause a recession, but would lead to a complete disintegration of the social and economic order. They were the heart of the system, and if the heart stopped beating, the entire body would die. But as the news of the bailouts broke, a profound and poisonous resentment began to brew in the streets of America. To the average citizen, the math didn't add up. While millions of families were losing their homes to foreclosure, while life savings were evaporating in real time, and while the middle class watched their stability vanish, the architects of the crisis were being shielded by the public purse. The optics were catastrophic. It appeared as though the system had been rigged to socialize the losses of the elite while privatizing their massive gains during the boom years. The outcry was visceral. It wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a fundamental breach of the social contract. The feeling that the game was fixed fueled a populist rage that transcended traditional party lines. In the years that followed, this anger would find its voice in two seemingly opposite but equally disruptive movements. On one side, you had Occupy Wall Street. Taking root in Zuccotti Park, these protesters channeled the fury of the 99%. They targeted the perceived immorality of the financial sector, protesting the vast inequality and the sense that a class of untouchable bankers lived by a different set of rules than the rest of humanity. Their message was clear. The system was broken, and the people were being left behind. On the other side, a different kind of discontent began to coalesce, a populist movement that targeted the institutions themselves, from the banks to the federal government. This wasn't just about economic fairness. It was about a loss of trust in the entire establishment. The bailout had successfully prevented a second Great Depression, but it had come at a staggering psychological cost. It had stabilized the markets, but it had destabilized the culture. Wall Street had been saved, but the public's faith in the fairness of capitalism had been shattered. As the dust began to settle on the immediate crisis, The world was left with a haunting, unresolved question. If the institutions that drive our economy are too big to fail, does that mean they are also too big to be held accountable? November 25, 2008, Washington, D.C. As the smoke from the initial bailouts cleared, a new, even more radical realization set in among the architects of the global economy. The traditional tools of monetary policy were no longer enough. For decades, central banks had fought recessions by simply lowering interest rates. But by the end of 2008, interest rates had hit what economists call the zero lower bound. They were at zero. There was no more room to cut, no more conventional lever to pull to jumpstart the stalled engine of global capitalism. The world was stuck in a liquidity trap. The banks, though fortified by TARP, were too terrified to lend. The consumers, paralyzed by debt and uncertainty, were too terrified to spend. The gears of commerce weren't just slowing down, they were grinding to a halt. To break this deadlock, the Federal Reserve, under the leadership of Chairman Ben Bernanke, decided to move beyond the playbook. They would move from managing interest rates to managing the very size and composition of the money supply itself. They called it quantitative easing, or QE. In theory, the process was clinical. The Federal Reserve would create new digital money out of thin air, not physical cash, but electronic credits. They would use this vast, newly created reservoir of liquidity to purchase massive quantities of long-term government bonds and mortgage-backed securities from the open market. By buying these assets on a gargantuan scale, the Fed aimed to drive down long-term interest rates, making it cheaper for businesses to expand and for families to refinance their homes. But in practice, QE was something much more profound. It was a massive, continuous, and unprecedented experiment in central bank intervention. It was the sound of the printing press being turned on in a digital age. As the years progressed, the scale of these interventions grew from the extraordinary to the systemic. Through multiple rounds of QE, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploded, ballooning from a few $100 billion to several trillion. The central bank was no longer just a referee in the background. It had become the most powerful player on the field. This era became known as the era of easy money. For Wall Street, the results were immediate and intoxicating. The flood of cheap liquidity acted like high-octane fuel injected directly into the veins of the financial markets. With interest rates suppressed and the central bank acting as a perpetual buyer of last resort, the perceived risk of investing plummeted. This created a phenomenon known as the reach for yield. Investors, unable to find meaningful returns in safe government bonds, were forced to move further out on the risk spectrum, pouring capital into equities, corporate debt, and increasingly speculative assets. The stock market didn't just recover, it entered a period of historic, almost surreal expansion. The disconnect between the real economy, the world of wages, jobs, and manufacturing, and the financial economy began to widen into a chasm. While the S&P 500 soared to new heights, driven by the tide of cheap credit, the average worker's prosperity remained stubbornly stagnant. Quantitative easing had achieved its primary goal. It had prevented a total systemic collapse. It had provided the liquidity necessary to keep the heart of Wall Street beating. But it had also fundamentally altered the DNA of the markets. It had created a new paradigm where the direction of the market was no longer dictated solely by corporate earnings or economic productivity, but by the ebb and flow of central bank liquidity. The era of easy money had arrived, and with it, a new kind of dependency, a world where the markets had become tethered to the life support of the central bank. 2012, Secaucus, New Jersey. In the sterile, temperature-controlled silence of massive data centers, a new kind of war was being waged. It was a war that didn't take place on the loud, shouting floor of the New York Stock Exchange, but within the microscopic confines of fiber optic cables and silicon chips. As the era of easy money flooded the markets with liquidity, the sheer volume of capital moving through the system reached a fever pitch. But as the scale of trading grew, the fundamental unit of value underwent a radical, terrifying transformation. It was no longer about the day, or the hour, or even the second. The new frontier was the millisecond. And in the world of high-frequency trading, or HFT, a millisecond is an eternity. For decades, Wall Street was a game of human intuition and information asymmetry, knowing something before someone else did. But by the early 2010s, the information being traded was no longer just news or earnings reports. It was the speed of light itself. High-frequency trading is the use of powerful algorithms to execute thousands of orders in the blink of an eye. These are not humans clicking a mouse. These are mathematical models executing complex strategies at speeds that the human brain cannot even perceive. These algorithms scan the entire global market, looking for the tiniest discrepancies in price, a fraction of a penny difference between a stock in New York and its derivative in Chicago. They see a pattern, they calculate the probability of profit, and they strike. All of this happens in less than 1,000th of a second. This created a new, invisible arms race. To win, it wasn't enough to have the best math. You had to have the shortest distance. This led to the phenomenon of co-location, where massive hedge funds and proprietary trading firms paid millions of dollars to place their servers in the very same buildings as the stock exchange's matching engines. If your server is 1 foot closer to the exchange than your competitors, you win. If you are 1 meter further away, you lose. The geography of Wall Street shifted from the physical streets of Lower Manhattan to the physical proximity of server racks. The battle became one of latency arbitrage, using ultra-fast connections to exploit the delay between different market data feeds. But this hyperspeed came with a dark side. The markets had become so interconnected and so reliant on these automated scripts that they became prone to flash crashes. Because these algorithms are programmed to react to one another, they can create a feedback loop of pure mathematical chaos. When one algorithm detects a sudden dip and begins to sell, it triggers 1,000 other algorithms to do the same, creating a digital stampede that can wipe out billions of dollars in market value in a matter of minutes, only to see it rebound just as quickly. The market had become a ghost in the machine. The liquidity that HFT provided made trading smoother and cheaper for some, but it also introduced a systemic fragility that no human could control. We had built a financial engine of unimaginable complexity, a machine that moved faster than the speed of thought, where the battle of the algorithms was constant, invisible, and utterly relentless. The heartbeat of Wall Street was no longer a pulse. It was a digital strobe light. 2013, Menlo Park, California. While the titans of Wall Street were engaged in a high-stakes arms race of milliseconds and microchips, a quiet, digital insurgency was brewing in the heart of Silicon Valley. For decades, the stock market had been a fortress, protected by high barriers to entry, exorbitant brokerage fees, and a complex language of finance that kept the average person on the outside looking in. To trade was to be part of an elite club. But then came Robinhood. It wasn't a bank and it wasn't a hedge fund. It was a sleek, gamified interface designed for the smartphone era. By eliminating commissions, Robinhood didn't just lower the cost of entry, it obliterated the gatekeepers. Suddenly, the tools used by professional traders were being placed into the palms of millions of teenagers, college students, and retail workers. The barrier to entry hadn't just been lowered, it had been demolished. This was democratization too. If the previous era was defined by the speed of the algorithm, this new era was defined by the power of the crowd. As the 2020s dawned, the world was thrown into chaos by a global pandemic. Lockdown sent millions of people home, staring at screens, possessing nothing but time and a growing sense of economic anxiety. They weren't just watching the markets, they were participating in them. They found each other in the digital trenches of Reddit, specifically in communities like r Wall Street Bets. Here, the traditional hierarchy of expert versus novice was flipped on its head. In these forums, financial wisdom was replaced by memes, and traditional valuation models were traded for diamond hands and to the moon. The movement reached its fever pitch in January 2021 with the GameStop short squeeze. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated financial populism. A group of retail investors, armed with nothing but social media coordination and sheer collective will, identified a massive vulnerability in the market: short interest. They saw that multi-billion-dollar hedge funds had bet heavily against companies like GameStop, essentially betting on their failure. The retail crowd didn't just decide to buy the stock, they decided to weaponize it. As thousands of individual traders rushed to buy GameStop shares simultaneously, the price didn't just rise, it exploded. It was a vertical ascent that defied every law of traditional finance. The hedge funds, caught on the wrong side of the trade, were forced to buy back shares at astronomical prices to cover their losses, creating a feedback loop that sent the stock price into the stratosphere. For a few chaotic weeks, the little guy wasn't just playing the game, they were breaking it. The fallout was seismic. It exposed the profound fragility of the market structure and the terrifying power of social media-driven sentiment. It led to congressional hearings, massive regulatory scrutiny, and a fundamental debate about the fairness of the system. Was this a glorious leveling of the playing field, or was it a dangerous new form of gambling fueled by digital tribalism? The era of the meme stock proved that the ghost in the machine was no longer just an algorithm. The ghost had a face, a username, and a smartphone. The retail revolution had arrived, and it had turned the carefully choreographed dance of Wall Street into a chaotic, unpredictable, and populist riot. The hierarchy was broken, and the world was watching. 2024, Zug, Switzerland. If the GameStop saga was a riot in the streets of the old financial order, then what followed was something far more fundamental: an attempt to rewrite the very laws of physics that govern value itself. For centuries, Wall Street has functioned as a system of intermediaries. You need a bank to hold your money. You need a broker to execute your trade. You need a clearinghouse to ensure the transaction actually happened. And you need a central bank to dictate the scarcity of the currency you are using. This is the trust model, a massive, expensive, and centralized architecture where every participant must trust a central authority to keep the ledger honest. But in the shadows of the digital revolution, a new philosophy was emerging: the truth model. It began with the white paper of Bitcoin, a cryptic manifesto that proposed something radical, a way to transfer value across the globe without a single bank, a single government, or a single middleman. This was the birth of the blockchain. At its core, blockchain is not just about digital coins. It is a decentralized, immutable ledger. It is a machine that replaces human trust with mathematical certainty. In this new world, the ledger isn't held in a vault in Manhattan. It is distributed across thousands of computers simultaneously, making it nearly impossible to forge, manipulate, or shut down. As the concept of decentralization moved from the fringes of cypherpunk forums to the center of global discourse, the implications for Wall Street became impossible to ignore. We entered the era of crypto, a period defined by extreme volatility, staggering wealth creation, and a relentless challenge to the hegemony of the US dollar. The rise of decentralized finance, or DeFi, took this a step further. If Bitcoin was digital gold, DeFi was digital Wall Street. Through smart contracts, self-executing code living on the blockchain, it became possible to lend, borrow, and trade assets without a single human being overseeing the process. The entire machinery of an investment bank was being compressed into lines of code. The gatekeepers weren't just being bypassed. They were being rendered obsolete by protocols that never sleep, never take bribes, and never require permission to use. Yet this new frontier is not without its ghosts. The collapse of massive entities like FTX and the volatility of stablecoins have proven that while the code may be math, the humans interacting with it are still prone to greed, fraud, and catastrophe. We are seeing a collision between two worlds: the ancient, regulated, and institutionalized halls of the New York Stock Exchange, and the wild, permissionless, and anarchic landscape of the blockchain. As we look toward the horizon, the line between these two worlds is blurring. Central banks are now racing to develop their own central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, attempting to marry the efficiency of the blockchain with the control of the state. Meanwhile, the greatest asset managers on Earth are integrating crypto assets into their traditional portfolios. The evolution of Wall Street is no longer just about who can trade the fastest or who has the most capital. It is about the very definition of what value is. Is value a social contract enforced by governments and banks? Or is value a mathematical certainty written in code? The wall is no longer a physical barrier in lower Manhattan. It is a digital boundary between the old world of centralized authority and a new world of decentralized truth. The next chapter of finance isn't being written in a boardroom. It is being coded into existence.